Good evening. At the end of the 19th century, the federal policy towards the native tribes changed from one of the only good Indian is a dead Indian to kill the Indian, save the man. This was in essence a transition from annihilation to assimilation. And the impetus behind this was the Dawes Act. Now the Dawes Act had several aspects to it. The first was to try to break the communal aspect of tribal life and to turn native tribes into individual property-owning farmers in the Western identity. The result of this conversion and the loss of about 155 million acres of land, roughly the size of Texas, I speak about in other lectures. But today what I'd like to focus on is another aspect of the Dawes Act which tried to break the cultural, linguistic, and spiritual history of Native peoples. Now, Western progressive reformers knew it was too late for the adults, so they concentrated on the children. And so by 1890, it was mandatory for all Native children until 1960, roughly 5 to 6 generations, other than a few exceptions, to go to residential boarding school. Now, if you refused to send your children to these schools, the punishments were very severe. Tribal allotments for food were withheld from the entire reservation. The most famous punishment was when 19 Hopi fathers refused to send their children to school, and they were sent to Alcatraz Federal Military Prison. Some of them died there. They were there for almost a year. Now, why would a parent risk death and prison rather than sending their children to school? That's really what I want to focus on today, because that pain and suffering of those 5 to 6 generations really lingers on, not only to indigenous cultures, but also in our whole society. And I want to kind of explain why that is. First, how does this journey begin to school? Well, they don't take everybody from one tribe and take them to one school. They would send a few to Oklahoma, a few to Flandreau in the Dakotas, a few to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This was done to isolate them from each other, so they couldn't speak their native language, they couldn't have their cultural rituals. Also, it was done so they geographically would be very far away from home, so it would be too risky, life-threatening almost, to run home, and their parents could not afford the required round-trip ticket in advance before they could go home. Now, these children were sent as young as 4 or 5 years old, and they did not come home on summers. They did not come home on holidays. Many people did not see their children for over a decade. They did not hear from them often for months or years. And while they were at these boarding schools, what happened to them? Well, when they first arrived, the first thing was to remove any sort of external identity. So their native regalia, their clothing, their religious artifacts were taken from them. In spite of the fact that many of the children arrived at the school with their very best clothing. One Ojibwe grandmother speaks of the fact that her grandmother had passed down a family blanket to her to take to school with her. And it was taken away because it was too savage to be worn. But yet, when she was required to clean the headmistress's house as part of her duties, that blanket was on the headmistress's sofa. When they removed the regalia and the clothing, they were replaced with worn out old military uniforms from the US Army and military boots. They were distributed by age and not size, so often they were too big. You had to wear them a minimum of 2 years, regardless of wear or growth. So one Comanche father talks about that his shoes were 3 sizes too big, and he would clomp up and down the steps, and his feet were so full of blisters and sores that they were always aching. Sometimes they were infected. Now, regardless, none of the Native children's regalia, religious items, or artifacts were ever returned to them when they left. Now, after the external identity is removed, the next step was to have their head shorn, to have a haircut. Now, to Western people, that might not seem all that significant, to have a haircut. But to Native peoples, it's part of our spiritual culture. A way for me to explain it to you is like this. So Western people often point to their heart, and they say, I know because I feel it in here. We see it in our art. We see it reflected in sculptures, that we think of the soul as being in the heart. But for indigenous peoples, we believe the soul is in your head. And so your hair comes out from your spirit. It reflects your inner spirit. And so the only times that we would, for instance, have our head shorn is like a warrior who flees from battle, right? And out of shame and humiliation would have his head shorn, right? Or a mother who lost a child out of grief would have their head shorn. The idea is that they're being reborn, right? Which is kind of apropos because the very next step after they have their head shaved is they would be renamed. They'd be given a Western Christian name. Again, this might not seem all that significant, but for indigenous cultures, we have a long history of our naming ceremonies. We earn our names, we're gifted our names. Names mean something very different and very deep to us. It's not just given to you and you change it as easily as a lot of my students do today. Now, this process then, after the initial onboarding, right, the isolation continues to grow because now you are forbidden from speaking your native language. You cannot practice your religious rituals, no dancing, no ceremonies. And if you were caught doing it, the punishments were very severe. Our own Margina Burge, who teaches here at TCC, who's a Comanche, her grandfather was tied up by his thumbs and hung to a pole because he refused to learn English fast enough. An Ojibwe grandfather tells a story, and he was very self-deprecating about this, that he had a really hard time learning English. And he was often shackled in irons and thrown into a root cellar. And he said one time they forgot him there, and it must have been quite a bit of time because it rained. And the rain started to fill up, and he was so hungry because he had been left there for days that he started to eat the bugs on the top of the water. Right? Another grandmother speaks of two girls who ran away, and they were caught and brought back. And the punishment for running away was to have your hands tied behind your back and have your feet tied together. And then they had to stand in the hallway in the school. They couldn't lean against the walls. They had to stand in the middle of the hall. And every time for their 2-day punishment that they would fall over from exhaustion, the headmistress would come out with a willow switch and she would whip them until they stood up again. Now these punishments, while horrific, right, being put on children at school, seem horrible, were not the worst aspects of the boarding schools. Right? In 1928, a group of independent doctors, Indian rights activists, architects, farmers toured 64 of the 78 boarding schools. Right? And they wrote a report, and in it they describe basically genocidal acts of the Bureau of Indian Affairs towards these children. John Collier, the author of the report, said the punishments used on these children was physical abuse equivalent to medieval torture, supplemented by starvation. He documented the starvation as the cost to feed the native children was 11 cents a day, while standards at the time for bare minimum maintenance of health was 35 cents. One of the actual menus he lists in the report said that the menu for the day was 3 tablespoons of porridge, basically oatmeal, 2 slices of bread, 1 teaspoon of grease fat, which is lard, like eating Crisco, and a half a cup of tea. I read a book once of letters that were written home by the children to their parents, and they all spoke of hunger, but there was one that really stuck out to me. It was from a girl who was writing to her mother, and she said, "I am always hungry. They treat us like pigs. Some of the boys hunt for stray cats to eat. Everyone cries from hunger." Now, still, it's not the worst part. There's more. Because in the Marion report, they talk about the facilities and what's happening at the schools with condemning the buildings. They boarded up the windows so children could not escape. The death rate was about 50% at these schools because of tuberculosis and trachoma. And in the Marion report, the doctors note that there was a lack of medical facilities. And doctors and the facilities themselves created the problems because we know by this time that these diseases are gotten through contact, through touching. And children with open TB sores slept in beds with healthy children. They worked in the kitchens. They worked in the laundries. They shared the one communal towel. In not one school that they researched, not one, did they find a single bar of soap. Now, they started the school year 30 to 40% over capacity. They stuffed the children in, sleeping 3 to 4 to a bed. And why would they do this? Why would they send us? Well, supposedly it was about the education. So let's talk about that. Well, from 1898 to 1910, Estelle Reed, who was the superintendent of Indian education, said that the curriculum should focus on manual skills because no amount of book learning will ever result in intelligence or independence for the savage. The response to the Merriam report about the food and the cost of the 11 cents versus 35 cents by the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs was 11 cents a day is an extravagant expense to be spent on these savages. So they were learning cooking, cleaning, sewing, farming, and harness making, things that they could have very easily learned at home. So a decade away at school to learn things they could have very easily learned at home. Huh? Why? Well, two reasons. First, obviously money, profit. The Bureau of Indian Affairs pays for the tuition for the students, the cost, based upon how many children were there at the end of the school year. So they had to have overcapacity at the beginning of the year because of the high death rates in order to have a lot of students at the end of the year to be paid for. Also, they kept the food costs low for more profits. They ran farms on the schools. The children were supposedly growing their own food, but they would sell the food out the back door to local farmers, and then the students would be hungry. All while, according to the Merriam report, the teachers ate steak and oranges, which for this time period was very good eating. They also made money by loaning out. That's why they did not send the children home over breaks and over holidays, because they had what were called outing programs, where they would lend out the students for domestics in homes, for farm hands on local farms, and the school would be paid for their labor. Right? So the second reason, besides profit, why they would do this was about the Dawes Act land grab. Right? Because how reservation law works, when the last person who is registered on that tribe, on that reservation, is no longer alive and there are no more people, the land reverts back. Right? So if the children are not home helping their parents to develop a surplus, a farming surplus, this is an agricultural time in the early 1900s. If they're not there to help their parents to make enough food to not only pay their bills, but to be able to afford the taxes on their land, they lose their home for taxes. This is also why at the boarding schools, many Native American women, we think estimated up to 20,000 between here and Canada, were involuntarily sterilized. They didn't even know it. They went for regular checkups. They did it as well. You might have seen on one of the episodes of Yellowstone that at the Indian healthcare facilities, they were often involuntarily sterilized. They were not told that this was happening. It's so that we no longer have any children left to be on the reservation, so that the land would revert back to the reservation. It's also part of the Indian Child Welfare Act that the schools would actually adopt out your child away for $5. It was a fee, and the school would make money literally adopting your child out to other people. And you would never hear why your child never returned home. You would be told that they died, or you would be told that they were gone. So all of this, when they returned home after generations of our grandmothers and our grandfathers being taught that they were worthless, their culture was worthless, they did not know the languages, they did not know the culture, they did not know the dances. How could our grandmothers and grandfathers become loving, nurturing parents when they couldn't love themselves, when they were not protected at home by their parents? They weren't raised by loving, nurturing parents. They were raised by brutal teachers who physically, emotionally, and sexually abused them. Then how could they become loving, nurturing parents? So how does that affect the new generations? Well, how do we then overcome all of this pain, overcome all of this, and reconnect to all of that knowledge of our ancestors? I always joke with my students that Indigenous peoples are like the blue avatar people. Right? We have all of this information, all of this knowledge, and it's gone. The disconnect after those 5 or 6 generations, all of that knowledge has been lost. All of that medical knowledge, educational knowledge. How are we ever going to even be able to understand the cost to all of us of this assimilation project? Big wig. Thank you.